Aerial refueling is a process that allows aircraft engines to get fuel while flying in the air. Many large air forces use this method today. It is like filling up your vehicle with gas from a tanker truck while driving fast on the road. A pilot from the Imperial Russian Navy, Alexander P. de Seversky, came up with the idea of refueling combat aircraft in the air in 1917. He later moved to the United States and worked as an engineer in the War Department. He got the first patent for air-to-air refueling in 1921. The first time someone transferred fuel from one plane to another was more of a show than a practical solution. On November 12, 1921, Wesley May, who walked on the wings of planes, climbed from a Lincoln Standard to a Curtiss JN-4 airplane with a can of gas on his back. He poured the gas into the tank of the JN-4 when he got there. This was not a very good way to refuel a plane in the air. In 1923, the U.S. Army tried a better way to refuel planes in the air at Rockwell Field, San Diego, California. They used a DH-4B biplane as a tanker and gave it a 50-foot hose with a valve that could stop the flow quickly. The tanker would fly above the other plane and lower the hose. The person in the back seat of the other plane would grab the hose and connect it to the plane. If the hose came off, the valve would stop the flow right away, so the fuel would not spray on the other plane and its pilot. The first test flight was on April 20, 1923. The plane stayed connected for 40 minutes but did not pass any fuel on purpose. They tested the equipment many times over the next few months with different fuel transfers. On June 27th, the pilots tried to break the record for flying the longest time. By August 27th, using this method, one of the DH-4Bs set 14 world records, with a flight that lasted more than 37 hours. This success made many private pilots try aerial refueling, mainly to set new records for flying the longest time. By June 1930, the record was 553 hours in the air with 223 refueling contacts. In July, the record was 647.5 hours in the Curtiss Robin monoplane Greater St. Louis, almost 27 days in the air. Pilots stayed in their planes for weeks without landing, sometimes getting out on special platforms to fix the engines in the air. Even with all this activity, the technology for aerial refueling did not improve much, and pilots still used the risky and awkward dangling hose method. In 1930, a Royal Air Force squadron leader, Richard L.R. Atcherley, invented a safer and easier method, called the looped hose method. In this method, the plane that needed fuel dragged a long line with a hook at the end. The tanker dragged a heavy line and flew behind and to one side of the other plane. It then flew to the other side, making the two lines touch and hook. The other plane then pulled in the lines and the hose from the tanker. The RF kept working on this system, adding a drogue to the hose that made drag and helped to roll out the hose in the air. By 1934, Alan Cobham of Britain started the company Flight Refueling Limited to make the small but important parts and hose connections that made aerial refueling possible regularly. Cobham thought that aerial refueling would be very useful for commercial aviation. He was wrong, though, because commercial planes never used his methods, but he was knighted later for his work in this field. During World War II, people did not work on improving this process much because they wanted to make planes that could fly very far with a lot of fuel inside them. In 1942, some people from FRL came to the United States and put their equipment on a B-24 Liberator tanker and a B-17 Flying Fortress receiver. The Army Air Forces wanted to make a lot of tanker and receiver planes. But they did not need to do that because they had planes like the B-29 Super Fortress that had a lot of fuel inside them. In 1948, U.S. Air Force General Curtis LeMay became the leader of the Strategic Air Command, and he wanted to make aerial refueling better. LeMay knew that the new jet-powered bombers used more fuel than the old piston-engine planes, and they also had to fly farther from the United States to the Soviet Union and back. The old aerial refueling systems were not good enough. For example, the hoses could not move a lot of fuel, and they could not work at high speeds. Around the same time that LeMay was trying to make aerial refueling better, the Boeing company started testing the Boeing boom system. This was a big pipe that was attached to the back of a B-29 and had small wings at the end. The pipe was lowered and flown to a connector on the receiver plane. This let the planes move fuel at high speeds, and more importantly, it let more than 6 times as much fuel go through the pipe per minute. Another good thing was the single-point refueling system on receiver planes, which let all of the fuel tanks on a plane be filled from one spot instead of from many spots on the plane. While the Air Force and Boeing were working on the flying boom, FRL was still working in Britain, trying to make a system that would let a one-seat plane get fuel from a tanker. FRL engineers made the probe-and-drogue system. This was a system where a small plane had a probe that could be plugged into a drogue at the end of a refueling hose behind a tanker. FRL did their first test on April 4, 1949, and soon the U.S. Air Force wanted this technology too. Over the next few years, the U.S. Air Force changed some of their old bomber and transport planes, making the KB-29 and KC-97 tankers. But SAC needed more, so they bought the Boeing KC-135, a tanker plane that was like it, the Boeing 707 airliner. During the 1950s, because LeMay wanted it a lot, SAC made a big KC-135 tanker fleet to help their B-52 bombers, which could not hit targets in the Soviet Union without getting fuel. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Soviet Union also tried aerial refueling. They made 3 of their Tupolev Tu-4 bombers, which were almost the same as the American B-29 Superfortress, into tankers and 3 into receivers. The Soviets tried a weird wingtip-to-wingtip system and also a normal probe-and-drogue system. But the Soviets stopped working on this until the early 1960s. Even then, they did not like aerial refueling as much as the U.S. Air Force did, and they liked to use smaller planes closer to their bases. The U.S. Air Force used both the flying boom and probe-and-drogue systems for many years. They finally stopped using the probe-and-drogue system and used only the boom, which could work at much higher speeds and move fuel much faster. The Navy liked the probe-and-drogue system better because they could put it on smaller planes that could land on carriers. Navy engineers also made a buddy stores system. This was a system where a fuel tank with a hose and drogue could let one plane give fuel to another plane that was the same, and they did not need special tanker planes. Helicopters had to fly very far to save the airmen who fell down in Vietnam. So in 1965, the Air Force put a refueling probe on the front of a CH-3 Jolly Green Giant helicopter and tried to refuel it from a U.S. Marine Corps KC-130 plane that had a hose and drogue system. The tests worked well, and soon helicopters were flying deep into North Vietnam to save pilots, using aerial refueling to fly farther. When the Air Force got the KC-10 extender plane in the early 1980s, they added some new things, like a boom and 2 hose and drogue systems, so they could refuel both Navy and Marine planes in the air. Even with all the new technology, commercial planes did not use aerial refueling. They liked to make planes with big fuel tanks inside, because it was cheaper than having a lot of planes that only gave gas to other planes. Aerial refueling is only for the military now, even though Sir Alan Cobham wanted to use it for commercial planes. That's all for today's video on the history and technology of aerial refueling. I hope you learned something new and enjoyed watching this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon to get notified when I upload new videos.